Okay, well, thank you and welcome to the second day of the St. Damien Conference and to our second keynote, the penultimate keynote. Brief comment on the schedule. Following this, we will have lunch. The sandwiches are already here. We will have another panel, a coffee break, and then Professor Desmond's keynote, and a brief reception of perhaps one drink once that's completed. So I would like now to introduce Professor Bocken. He holds the chair of mystical theology here at KU Leuven. He also holds a professorship in the Faculty of Philosophy, Theology, and Religious Studies at the Radboud University of Nijmegen, where he is also the director of the Titus Brandsma Institute. Professor Bocken received his initial formation in philosophy and religious studies in his home city of Antwerp and Leuven, before pursuing doctoral studies in philosophy in Nijmegen. His doctoral dissertation inquired into the philosophical theology of Nicholas of Cusa and came to be published as a monograph entitled, in translation, The Art of Collecting Historical Ethical Introduction to the Conjectural Hermeneutics of Nicolaus Cusanus, and has appeared in Dutch, German, and French. His subsequent work has centered on the historical relationship between mysticism, theology, and philosophy, taken against the background of contemporary questions concerning the place of religion and spirituality in a secular or post-secular society. Perhaps the central motif uniting these questions is the relation between the active and the contemplative life. From the Jesuit historian Michel de Certeau, and in the wake of de Lubac, he receives a historical problematization of the dissolution of the medieval church as corpus mysticum, that is, the breakdown of the unified sacramental and symbolic arrangement of Christendom in the late medieval and first centuries of the modern period. Mysticism as a discourse in modernity appeared as a response to this crisis. In his view, as I understand it, the proper philosophical response to that crisis he finds in Nicholas of Cusa, the 15th century German cardinal, whose art of conjecture he reads as an art of collecting, of verzamelen, finite and perspectival knowing that is nonetheless genuinely and really related to and gestures towards truth, but in which plurality is not relativized simply and absolutely, but is the form in which truth becomes publicly, socially, and ecclesially accessible. And following Maurice Blondel, Bocken extends this insight into modernity. Contemplation and action are held in generative tension rather than in mere opposition without connection, with the Carmelite and the Ignatian spiritual traditions serving as a paradigm of what it means to think through practice. These threads find a recent convergence in his 2024 intellectual biography of St. Titus Brandsma, entitled Denker voor Gods aangezicht, or Thinker Before the Face of God. Brandsma was a Dutch Carmelite mystic canonized by Pope Francis in 2022, a figure in whom the contemplative and the political were inseparable. Brandsma served as a witness to the conviction that mystical thinking is a source for resistance to both totalitarian politics of modernity and technocratic reduction of humanity. Today, Professor Bocken turns these themes towards the question of Cusanus' vision of the church. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here. It is really an honor. I heard so many already about these conferences, and now I know that it really exists. And thank you for the introduction. And I think you, in case you will not understand what I'm saying, you explained already what is the background of what I try to share with you, and I'm glad that I'm able to share some thoughts on a topic that attracts me and I'm working on the last 2 years, I think, and so my thinking is changing all the time, and I think it is a rereading of Cusa against the background of the Council of Basel in the 15th century. And perhaps you may think, oh, Council of Basel, that's 600 years ago. But you know what I will say, the Council of Basel never was officially closed, so that means it's still going on, so we are talking about the council that is still going on. Let me begin with a phrase that is both ancient and surprisingly relevant today. Man is the measure of all things, from Protagoras of Abdera. A statement that seems simple but has enormous scope. For what does it actually mean to say that man is the measure? It means that what is true, what is good, what is real is ultimately determined from the human perspective. Man measures, man judges, man is the point of reference. And in many ways, that is also our world. But perhaps today we also see the limits of this statement. We see it in the ecological crisis. For decades, we have measured the world in terms of utility, growth, and efficiency. Nature was understood through human standards as something that could be managed, exploited and optimized. But that is precisely where we are finding a limit today. For reality turns out not to align with the measure we impose on it. The systems we rely on respond in ways that cannot be fully predicted, controlled or reduced. Is it not this that makes Protagoras' statement problematic again today? For what is the measure of the measure? Who or what determines the measure by which we measure? That is not an abstract question. More and more decisions are being made based on models and algorithms. Behavior is analyzed, risks are calculated, performance is quantified. Everything seems measurable. And yet it remains unclear who or what determines the standard by which we measure. Or consider something simpler, but perhaps even more fundamental. How do we measure good life today? The measure is at work everywhere, but nowhere present. That is where the question becomes urgent. Is humanity truly the ultimate measure? Or is there something that eludes this measure and thereby defines it? And at this point it becomes interesting to look at Nicholas of Cusa. A thinker from 15th century in an era marked by a crisis of metaphysics under the influence of the so-called nominalism and voluntarism, and at the same time on, like Hans Blumenberg mentions it, the threshold of modern thinking about subjectivity. Not because he simply offers an alternative to Protagoras, that's the interesting thing, but because he takes this statement seriously. Cusanus quotes this statement of Protagoras several times, for example in De Berillo, and he takes it as a really starting point of his reflections. He is familiar with the idea that man, the microcosm, the second God, is the measure. And he thinks it through to the point where it becomes problematic. Since for Cusanus, at the same time, it is not man who is the ultimate measure. That is God, the mensura absoluta. At the same time, and this is very important for Cusa, this measure is not accessible for reason. It cannot be measured. It cannot be possessed. It does not coincide with any perspective. Here we see in the thinking of Cusanus a tension arise. If man is the measure, but the measure simultaneously eludes man, how then do we measure? How do we judge? How do we live together? But here the question becomes even sharper. What happens when not only is the measure missing, but when multiple standards are at play simultaneously? When different perspectives each claim validity, each proposing its own ordering of reality, and none of them can be convincingly reduced to a single common standard. As we know, this is not merely a theoretical problem. It is a concrete experience for Cusanus. It is precisely, I think, one of the most important experiences with which Cusanus is confronted. Not primarily in a study. I think his theoretical works are in permanent dialogue with the practice of society of his time, in political and ecclesiastical practice. And in that time, that was the same. The Council of Basel. It started 1431. It exploded 1437. Then the Pope and Cusanus and others left the council. And then they continued in Basel. The Pope and Cusa and others went to Ferrara and Florence, but they were discussing there more on the unity with the Eastern Church. Basel, for Cusa, it becomes clear what it means that man is the measure, not as unity, but as multiplicity. Not a single perspective, but multiple, mutually competing standards. Papal authority, that was the discussion, or conciliar representation, tradition, law, theology. Each of these claims to be the standard by which the unity of the Church can be determined. And it is precisely this that creates an impasse. Not because there is no standard, but because there are too many. The question of the standard here becomes a question of conflict, a question of dissent. The Council of Basel, and as I said, it was never officially closed, but the last session was 1449, was convened to restore unity and reform the Church after decades of ecclesiastical crisis. But the council soon became the stage for a fundamental conflict. Who ultimately possesses authority in the Church? That's in fact in society. The Pope or the Council representing the universal Church. What made the situation explosive was that both sides could appeal to compelling theological, legal and historical arguments. As I said, the conflict eventually led to schism in 1437, part of the council break with Pope Eugene IV. Continued independently for years, elected even an anti-pope, Felix V. And the council itself was never formally concluded. And the German nobility was very confused. Who was the dialogue partner for politics? So there are a lot of historians saying this was one of the moments where the separation of church and state was reinforced. In this situation, it becomes clear that traditional metaphysical frameworks are under pressure. The influence of nominalism, which no longer regards universal concepts as self-evident carriers of reality, undermines the idea that there is a single common order in which all differences can be accommodated. What disappears is not just certainty. What is disappearing is the self-evidence of a shared measure. To understand this, we must first analyze the situation more closely. since it is within this context that Cusanus must develop his thought, not outside the situation, but right in the midst of it. And we see it in his first book. He writes his first main book really within the council, the Concordancia Catholica, who is a kind of guide for the council fathers, council participants. On the one hand, a new era is dawning in which humanity is increasingly understood as the measure of all things. On the other hand, it shows that the measure can never be complete, that it always points to something that transcends it. And in my thesis today is that it's precisely in this tension that a space emerges, a space in which action remains possible without a definitive foundation, a space in which judgment remains possible without an absolute measure, a space in which community can emerge without difference being abolished. It is a question of practice for Cusanus. If that is the case, if the question of measure is ultimately a question of praxis, then we must look more closely at the structure of this relationship itself. For what does it actually mean that measure withdraws? And how can precisely this withdrawal open up a space for community? To understand that, we must return to the way this tension has been philosophically conceived. That's my next point. What becomes visible in Basel, then, is not merely a conflict of positions, but a deeper problem. The inability to connect a general standard with concrete reality. Let me clarify that briefly. The medieval order was based on the assumption that an objective measure exists, a divine order in which the general and the particular ultimately converge. General concepts, norms, and structures derive their validity from a reality that sustains them. But it's precisely this assumption that came under pressure in this period, the late Middle Ages. The general loses its self-evident ontological foundations. Universals are no longer understood as real structures of reality, but as concepts that the human mind forms to make the multitude of particulars manageable. Universal standards are no longer anchored in an objective order. The Council is still marked by the old order. It seeks a general standard in which the unity of the Church can be established. But at the same time, it becomes clear that this standard can no longer be convincingly grounded. The general concepts in which one thinks, authority, representation, unity, no longer correspond to reality in a way that makes them conclusive. For the moment, the general standard loses its self-evidence. The necessity to decide remains. One cannot avoid judging. But on what basis? It is precisely here that another solution for the coming centuries to come presents itself. A solution that finds a classical formulation in early modern political philosophy with Thomas Hobbes. I think there you see the radicalization of the nominalist insight which was undermining Basel. If there is no given standard capable of ordering the plurality of perspective, then this standard must be established. Not found, but chosen. Not discovered, but imposed. The unity of the political order then no longer rests on a shared truth, but on a decision that grounds itself. The sovereign, the mortal God, becomes the authority that establishes the standard and thereby ends conflict. The census is resolved by power. This is an extraordinarily powerful solution, mainly in times of uncertainty. but it has a price. For the mediation between general standards and concrete reality is not resolved, but replaced by a decision that eludes further justification. The standard functions, but only as an effect of power. And does this not raise the question of whether the modern liberal state, which understands itself as a neutral order, can still conceal its origins in a decisive and beyond that unfounded act of violent power? Are we today, not centuries after Hobbes, facing the consequences of this solution? Do we not live in political orders in which the measure does function, but its foundation remains unclear, and in which the tension between general norms and concrete reality leads to conflict time and again? I do not wish, of course, to answer this question here, but merely to leave it open, for it is precisely at this point that it becomes interesting to look at Cusa's solution, or his attempts to struggling with that. Not because he offers an alternative in the sense of a different measure, like a lot of Cusa interpreters today are saying, but because he conceives of a different way of dealing with the tension. When we return to the Council of Basel from this perspective, it becomes clear that what is unfolding there is not merely a historical incident, but an experience in which this tension presents itself for the first time with full intensity. The Council is convened with a clear intention to restore the unity of the Church and reform its order. The questions structuring the debate seem clear and decidable. Where does the highest authority lie? With the Pope as the bearer of unity, or with the Council as the representation of the whole Church? This is how Basel is often interpreted, as a constitutional conflict between two models of order. But it is precisely this reading that presupposes everything that becomes problematic at Basel. It assumes that there is a standard by which this question can be definitively decided, that there is an authority capable of embodying unity and thereby ending the conflict. And it is precisely this assumption that begins to fail at Basel. For what happens when both positions, papal and conciliar, invoke valid arguments, when both traditions, both legal lines, both theological claims are convincing within their own horizons? Then no solution emerges but an impasse. Not because people disagree. Disagreement is conceivable in any political order. But because one can no longer see how this disagreement can still be conceived within a single whole. The shared framework in which difference still appears as an internal difference within a single order begins to disappear. That is what's happening at Basel. What becomes visible there is not merely a conflict of positions, but a crisis of visibility itself. The Church can no longer simply appear as a single body within the available forms of representation. It does not coincide with the institutions that are supposed to represent it. It escapes the measure in which it must be made visible. And with that, the question shifts. No longer who has the final say, but under what conditions can the Church still appear as one? The shift is subtle but decisive. For what is at stake here is not only the distribution of power, but the very possibility of perceiving unity at all. Nicholas of Cusa finds himself in the midst of this experience. In the Concordancia Catholica, the Catholic Concordance or the General Concordance, written in the context of the council itself, he still attempts to organize the multitude of voices. He gathers arguments, reconstructs traditions. It is really an amazing book when you want to know the history of canon law, or the history of church history and the history of philosophy in connection with that. It seeks a form of concordance in which difference does not lead to schism. But it is precisely this attempt that reveals its limits. For as long as one assumes that concordance can ultimately be established in an institutional form, in a decision, a structure, a hierarchy, one remains dependent on a measure that pretends to coincide with the unity it is meant to guarantee. And that is precisely what proves impossible now in Basel. The failure of the council is therefore not merely a historical failure, it is a revelation. It reveals that unity cannot be produced through closure, that no form, no instance, no decisions can bear the unity it claims to realize. As long as unity is conceived as the result of a conclusive order, it remains dependent on a measure that absolutizes itself and thereby destroys precisely the space in which difference can appear. For Cusanus, this experience does not mean a withdrawal from political issues, as is often said in Cusa scholarship. It's a radical displacement of them. If no institutional form can guarantee unity, then the question must be posed differently, no longer in terms of structure, but in terms of conditions. Under what conditions can unity emerge in a reality characterized by difference? What appears as a political impasse in Basel calls for deeper reflection. And it is precisely this reflection that leads to the next step in Cusa's thinking. Not a new institutional solution, but a reformulation of the relationship between measure and reality itself. That is the focus of his work, De Docta Ignorantia, on learned ignorance. We know that it has been finished in 1440, February 12, he writes himself. So some years after his leaving of Basel and after his travel to Constantinople, where he was in dialogue with some of the Eastern Church, and he brought some of the Byzantine intellectuals with him on the boat, on the ship, from Constantinople to the council in Ferrara, where they Bessarion is the most famous one, and perhaps the emperor was on board too. We don't know exactly, but there are some sources saying that. And that is in the On Learned Ignorance, in the Docta Ignorantia, Cusa describes how this, on the boat, he has this new insight. Just when they pass the coast of Greece, that means the country of philosophy, then he had this insight of learned ignorance, this new way of thinking. And for it is true that the failure of the council is not merely a failure, a revelation, and this revelation on the boat, a revelation of the inability to fix unity in a single measure. And this experience cannot fail to have consequences for the way we know and act. The question now is, what does it mean that we act in a reality in which the measure eludes us? Or to put it in another way, what does it mean that we must judge without possessing the measure by which our judgment can be definitively justified? And it is precisely this question that Cusa takes up in the Docta Ignorantia. What we see there is not a retreat from political reality, but a search for a different form of theorizing. a way of thinking that does justice to the experience that the standard is no longer available as a conclusive foundation. He does not simply attempt to formulate a new standard. He seeks a way of thinking that can cope with the fact that every standard eludes complete determination. What appears in Basel as a dissensus between positions is recognized there as a structural property of knowing itself. Not because reality is chaotic, but because the measure by which it is ordered cannot be reduced to any finite perspective. In that sense, the Docta Ignorantia is not a correction of the political crisis, but an attempt to understand what the crisis reveals. It reveals that the tension between measure and reality cannot be resolved, and that precisely therein lies the condition for a different form of action. Not an action based on definitive measure, but an action that orients itself in the awareness that that measure is never fully available. Next point, Docta Ignorantia as a form of practice. When Cusa rethinks the relationship between measure and reality, in this book he does not do so by seeking a new theoretical foundation in the classical sense. He does not attempt to solve the problem that became apparent in Basel. He tries to understand it as a structural property of knowledge itself. His starting point is simple, yet far-reaching. Knowing is measuring. But, and this is crucial, measuring, mensurari, does not mean that we possess the measure. To understand what Cusanus means by this, we must briefly consider the structure of this knowing itself. When he says that knowing is measuring, he does not mean that we have a fixed measure with which we can simply determine reality. On the contrary, to measure here means to compare. Comparatio, proportio. We understand something by placing it in relation to something else. The unknown is approached from the known. We move from what we think we know to what we do not yet know. But therein lies a problem. For this movement presupposes a standard, a criterion by which we can compare. And at the same time, it's very easy in fact to understand, at the same time it turns out that this measure is never fully available. Since we are never certain about the fact that we know which measure we have to use for what we measure. Measurement presupposes a coincidence of measure and the measured, a point at which the ratio would be exact, but that point is never reached. There is always a remainder. What we use as a standard turns out now to be definitely fixed itself. The measure too, the measure itself must be measured anew, compared anew, determined anew. In other words, what seemed known turns out to be unknown itself. And because of this, knowing remains in motion. It is a practice of comparing, of shifting, of revisiting. No stand still in a definitive measure, but a constant orientation toward a measure that eludes us. Herein lies, in my interpretation, the meaning of the Docta Ignorantia, of Docta Ignorantia, of the concept of Docta Ignorantia. This does not mean that we know nothing. It is not a skepticism or agnosticism at all. But that we know our knowledge never coincides with the measure toward which it is directed. This means knowing is not possession, but a movement within an order that eludes us. When we measure, we establish relationships, Cusanus says. We compare, distinguish, and organize. We place reality within a certain perspective, but all these actions presuppose a measure. measure which is not available. God, as the mensura absoluta, is not an object of knowledge, but that to which all knowledge relates without ever reaching it. And that fundamentally changes the nature of knowing. That is why knowing is practice. For whoever measures acts. It's l'action. Whoever judges takes a position. Whoever orders moves within a whole that he never can fully grasp. There is no neutral place outside this movement, and that means the situation in Basel is not an exception. It is the rule. What appeared there as a dissensus between human standards turns out to be the structural condition of every human judgment. We cannot help but judge, but we judge without possessing the measure by which our judgment can be definitively justified. In this lies not a deficiency, but a possibility. That is docta ignorantia. For precisely because no single standard is fully available, no single perspective can become absolute. The space of difference remains open. And with that, a form of action emerges that is not based on closure, but on orientation, comparison, mediation. Docta ignorantia is therefore not a theory of a lack of knowledge. It is the articulation of a praxis, a way of dealing with reality in which the measure withdraws permanently, and in which action remains possible without definitive grounding. Next point, the conjectura, the form of action. It is true that knowing is a movement without definitive measure. Then a new question immediately arises. How then do we act? How do we judge when we know that no judgment can coincide with the measure upon which it relies? It is precisely this question that Cusanus addresses in his second philosophical main work, so the third work after Concordantia Catholica, Docta Ignorantia, where the new model is established. And already in the Docta Ignorantia he announces the writing of this third book, De Conjecturis, Conjecture. And his answer is as simple as it is radical. Every human judgment is a conjectura, conjecture, throwing together, like cymbalein. That is to say, an attempt to approach the truth without ever fully possessing it. Conjectura is not a weak form of knowledge, not a provisional step towards certainty. It is the form of knowing that fits a reality in which the measure eludes us. For if no single perspective can fully encompass the measure, then no single judgment can be absolute. But that does not mean that all judgments are equal. On the contrary, conjecture requires practice. A constant weighing, comparing, adjusting. A way of judging that is aware of its own limitations and precisely for that reason remains open to correction. And here appears a concept, and some of you know that I'm addicted to this concept, that Cusanus already employs in his conciliar thinking. And he knew from his knowledge of the juridical tradition, but which takes on a broader meaning in this new context, and that is the concept of epieikeia. Epieikeia is often translated as equity, but its meaning is more radical. It refers to the virtue of correcting the rule in the name of justice itself. For every, we can read it already in Aristotle, in his Ethics. For every general rule is necessarily limited. No law, no institution, no universal norm can anticipate the singularity of every concrete situation. A rigid application of the rule may therefore become unjust precisely by applying the rule mechanically. And we know the principle, of course, also in Aquinas, where Aquinas radicalizes even Aristotle. In Aristotle it is more a juridical argument. For Aquinas, the same is true for even for the laws of morality. Epieikeia means judging with an eye for the concrete, not simply applying the rule, but asking what fidelity to the rule truly requires in this situation. In that sense, epieikeia is not a rejection of order, but the refusal to absolutize it. The rule remains necessary, but it can never function without interpretation, judgment, and mediation, or without life. The life, it is not about the rule, it is about the life. Epieikeia means judging with an eye for the concrete. It is important to recognize that this is not a later addition to Cusanus' thought, but is already present in his conciliatory practice. In the Concordantia Catholica, it appears implicitly as a critique of any attempt to establish a single definite standard, whether that be the Pope, the Council, or even Scripture. He rejects the use of scriptural arguments because when they are not discussed within the community of the Church. Thus, Cusanus opposes the position of Marsilius of Padua, who seeks to ground the ecclesiastical order on an unambiguous reading of Scripture. And in his dialogues with the Hussites, he does not reject the practice itself of the Hussites, but rather its absolutization. He even invents the word there. He likes to invent words. Epieikeizare. The problem of the Hussites is not their practice of the double communion. The problem of the Hussites is they have lost the ability of epieikeizare, of using the epieikeia. What is at stake here is always the same. No single authority, legal, institutional, or textual, can fully possess the measure. The standard functions only within a living practice of interpretation, the Church, in which different voices relate to one another without any one of them being definitely conclusive. Epieikeia is the name for this practice. It preserves the space in which judgment remains possible, without it becoming absolute, not arbitrarily, but in the awareness, and this awareness is constitutive, that the measure upon which it relies is never fully available. It is the practical form of docta ignorantia. It takes seriously the fact that standard is lacking, but does not refuse to judge because of it. It keeps the space open between rule and reality, between general standards and concrete situation. It is in that space that action takes place. What emerges here is a form of practice that differs fundamentally from both arbitrariness and absolutism. Not a decision that justifies itself because of the decision, as in the voluntaristic model of power, which is in our world very popular again, but also not an application of rules that claims to be definitive. What emerges is a mediating practice, an action that moves between perspectives, that does not eliminate difference, but attempts to organize it without closing it off. In this, what Cusanus ultimately has in mind becomes visible, not a community based on a shared fixed standard, but a community that arises in the practice of judgment itself, a community that is not predetermined, but takes shape in the way people deal with difference. And that is what he refers to as what he calls an ecclesia conjecturalis. This is the concept Cusa uses in his letter to his colleague diplomat Rodrigo Sanchez de Arevalo with Ecclesia Conjecturalis. And it is in the same letter that he rejects the conciliarists because they are not able to epie Caesare. That's the argument for the Hussites, but it's the same for the conciliarists. If this is correct, if knowing is a form of measuring without a definitive measure, and if judgments therefore always takes the form of conjectura and epieikeia, then a final decisive question arises. What does this mean for the community itself? Not only how do we judge, but how do we live together under these conditions? I think this was a question that was really important for the diplomat Cusanus, permanently on travel and bringing together people. The question of measure thus turns out to have always been a question of community. For if no measure is fully available, then no form of community can rest on a definitive foundation. It cannot be fixed in a structure, cannot be guaranteed by an authority, nor sealed in a decision. And yet it exists. It arises and continues to exist in the very practice of judgment, in the way people deal with difference, how they relate perspectives to one another, how they keep the tension between rule and reality open. What becomes visible here is a different way of conceiving community, not as a unity that is given in advance, but as a unity that takes shape in the praxis of mediation, not as the resolution of difference, but as the bearing of it. And this is precisely what Cusa refers to with this striking formulation, the Ecclesia Conjecturalis, a church that is not visible as a fixed order, but as a living practice of interpretation. We have to recognize the signs, the conjectures of the living body of Christ. Not a single form that embodies unity, but a multitude of forms in which that unity presents itself, never fully, never definitively, yet still real. The idea does not imply a weakening of the church, on the contrary. It reveals that its unity does not rest on closure, but on a living relationship to a standard she does not possess. If it is here that the final question arises, if this measure is not available, yet remains active, what then is its place? Where is she present? How can it be present without ever coinciding with what we measure? In the centuries after Cusanus, this open space of judgment increasingly came under pressure, as we all know. Against the background of religious conflict and political instability, modern political thought sought certainty, order, and closure. What Hobbes ultimately offers is a solution to dissensus through sovereign decision, unity secured by power. Within such a framework, epieikeia becomes increasingly suspect, as we know from the intellectual history. For even thinkers such as Kant and Hegel, the idea that judgment might move beyond the strict application of the universal law appeared dangerous. Hegel, and it's very clear, because it seemed to threaten the universality of reason itself. Even Francisco Soares, the Jesuit thinker, who still grants epieikeia an important place within his legal philosophy, ultimately neutralizes part of its paradoxical creativity by subordinating epieikeia once again to a stable and univocal rational order. And perhaps this is why returning to Cusanus matters today. For Cusanus does not simply offer another theory of authority, nor another foundation for political order. What he offers is a way of thinking community under conditions of irreducible plurality, a way of judging without absolutizing judgment, a way of sustaining unity without eliminating difference. And perhaps it's here that Ecclesia becomes philosophically significant again, not merely as a religious institution, but as the name for a form of community that can exist only through mediation, interpretation, and the shared practice of bearing difference. Perhaps that is what Cusanus invites us to consider, not how we can determine the right measure, but how we can live in a reality in which measurement itself, in all its provisionality, participates in a measure it can never possess. It is, as his quotation of Protagoras in De Berillo, man is the measure of all things, not because he possesses the measure, but because he participates in a measure that precedes him. That was everything I had to say.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. I guess as I was thinking about what you were saying, so a couple of things came to mind. So one thing I was thinking about, which is interesting in reference to the Council of Basel, is that at the time of the Council of Trent, the Council of Basel, which of course, the Council of Basel, the kind of second portion after it had broken up and split, is in the kind of traditional Roman way of thinking of theology, is a kind of invalid council, so its decrees aren't sort of upheld as valid. But the French theologians at the time of the Council of Trent very much thought of the kind of second part of Basel as a valid council that had normative weight for the way in which they did theology. But that also didn't preclude the possibility of communion and of a kind of open dialogue within the church. So which I think in some ways might strike us as odd, but even if they didn't always admit it openly, everyone agreed that there could be this dissensus about the status of Basel, for instance, and the possibility of conversation and of living together within a communion was still there. And I can think of other kind of more early modern examples in terms of the theology of the schools. Anyways, what I'm wondering is, how in a kind of positive sense do you see Cusa's way of thinking of church as something which continues to function in the early modern period and going forward even in the church today? Because we can see maybe ways in which there is this kind of absolutizing model of thinking of church that is influenced by what's happening in political philosophy, but in other ways it still very much seems alive. So I'm wondering if you have any comments on that, if that makes sense. Thank you.
When I understand your question rightly, then you can say that the ecclesiology of Cusanus is in fact a political philosophy. The political philosophy after Cusanus is in fact a consequence of the dissensus coming up in Basel. You see it. I think, it is a huge question. I mean, how we can what I'm tried to say with referring to the conjecture is that Cusa was more interested in the question, how do we observe the church and where do we observe it? Is more important than the concrete political structure of the church. We can find the church everywhere, since it is the body of Christ. It presupposes a different way of observing reality, and that is what I think. That was my interpretation, at least. What he finds in epieikeia, it's a different way of dealing with rules, a kind of reversed perspective, not as a rule closing a reality, but the rule as the opening of the space for the living reality. So, and that is in tension with a modern way of dealing with reality, I think. The controlling view, the way of how we deal with rules. It's not by accident that the virtue of epieikeia was seen as something dangerous, and I think Cusa tries to think as a diplomat, as someone who is within practice, as someone who is within the church, and the measure of his dealing with reality is where do I see the church? And I see the church where the virtue of epieikeia, or love, that's the end of the Conjectural, it is very interesting. I found out that I mean, it was, of course I did not find out, but I never saw this before. I saw this only last year, that the last book of De Docta Ignorantia, the last chapter is a very long treatise, De Ecclesia, and the Conjecturis he puts a step further, and there the last chapter is on love, how to find love, and that means how to realize where can we observe this, where can we, and that is for him more important than the juridical discussion on. Of course, this is important too. That he always remains a canon lawyer. There is no epieikeia without rule, so it is important. But we have to understand rules differently, as a worldly way. And when you ask for today, I think that is the way of, in the Cusanian way of being in the church, is the church is that instance that deals differently with rules than the worldly view on the rules. So that would my offer from Cusanus for today. And I see that you mentioned the second part of the Basel. Cusa had no problem with conciliarism. In the contrary, in the Concordantia Catholica, he gives a lot of arguments for the conciliarists, for the legitimacy of what they said, and that's also the reason why in the superficial biographies you can read, oh, first he was a conciliarist, and then because of his ambition he became a papalist. But that's not. I'm conjecturally sure about it. He has a problem with the conciliarists because what he's saying about the Hussites, they are not able to epie caesare. They take their arguments too serious. You only can take your argument serious when you discuss about it in the community, which is the church, and that presupposes that you know that every rule, every insight, every principle is not the end of life, but is the opening of the life space. And you can see it in the whole of Cusa's philosophy is about that, I think. You see it when some people are mocking this, that he puts just the adjective viva, and then he's there, imago viva, even the living psalter, you have to become a living psalter, the viva, the vivus. That is he's looking a kind of art of discernment between the mortuus and the vivus. The image is a good example. You have the imago mortua and the imago viva. The imago mortua is just a copy of reality. That means it's an image that closes reality. The imago viva is that image that shows no. Now you have to start. Now it's up to us. Now we can act. So it is this kind of discernment, and this discernment is leading the way. We observe the church in reality, and everyone within the church should follow this discernment. And I think they all do. Yeah. I'm not sure about that last one, but I hope that. I don't know whether this is.
Very helpful, thank you.
Professor Desmond?
Thank you very much. That was a very rich paper. Some of the things that I will say later will be very much in community with what you're saying. I was wondering about the Apiceia. The sound of something like phronesis was coming in my mind as you were speaking of it, because I was thinking of Aristotle. The ethical measure can't be a mathematical measure, for instance. And yet there is a measure, but it's inseparable from the living individual who is the embodiment of phronesis. And phronesis is something that, again, it can't be theoretically constructed. It has to be the result of nuanced experience in life and its ambiguity and so on. It's something that but I also I had the other question then about the question of evil and sin. If you know the divisiveness that actually comes into community. We are in community. We are oriented to richer community, but we also fall into divisiveness. Literally, divisiveness is the cut. There's something about our communal situation that is a kind of kink. There's a kink in it. We would be together, but being together we fall apart. Just think of the fall after they eat the apple, they start quarreling with each other. So that seems to be constitutive of our post-lapsarian condition also. And I'm wondering if Cusa sort of incorporates that into his own nuanced recuperation of this more living, open mediation that seems to be at the center of this work.
Of course. First of all, he is. Cusa is not so interested in evil and sin that he's very optimistic thinker, but we are in that post-Lapsarian condition. That is also the ignorance, but what he stresses is that we have within this condition have the ability to know that we are in this condition, and to know that we are in this condition means that we are able to transcend it, and without the very good example of this is the ball game, the ludus globi, late work, and it's we can play it out, but I don't have it with me. But you have to throw a ball within the midst of 9 concentric circles, and when you are in the mid, you have 34 points. But there is a hole in the ball, and this is of course a symbol for the globe is the absolute. Human beings are the absolute, but with a hole. And the consequence in the game is that we cannot calculate to reach the goal because of this hole. With the mathematics of his time, but even with modern mathematics, he would say, but there are still the conditions of weather, etc. There's always something, but we can learn to deal with this condition. We can learn to be better. We can exercise, and indeed, I saw it myself. I saw people who did the game so many times, and they are better in dealing with this condition. So, in that sense, we are in the condition, but we have awareness of another condition, and that is, of course, also for him founded in a Christological way and so on. But and that is also you have docta ignorantia, you have also indocta ignorantia, the ignoble situation, and of course there the situation starts again, but there I think he has the answer now, but it is not enough to have a full theory, you have to find it again and again, like the ball game. He says, don't think, he has sometimes he has a sense of humor. He says, don't think if you reach the goal once that you are ready, then since you have to play again, you have to start again. I reached the goal myself 3 times, so that you know who you have before you. But it was by accident when I hope this is some of the...
the phronesis point?
The phronesis, yeah. Epieikeia presupposes phronesis. Epieikeia is of course a very strange virtue. It is a virtue between moral philosophy, juridical field, theory and practice. It is. You could always say it is a kind of meta virtue, how you have to deal also with other virtues and with situations of uncertainty. And in that sense, it is, of course, it presupposes phronesis, but is stressing the necessity of the concrete realization of the virtue too. So, and I think that is, I think that's the reason why Aristotle gives it such a prominent place.
If I could add one thing on the question of sin, in the sermons he gave between the time of composing De Concurrencia Catholica and De Docta Ignorantia in the 1430s, he speaks quite clearly about how, in some sense, sin is nothing other than grounding our measures within the finite rather than the infinite mystery of God. If we ground it in the latter, it's formed into a love of being measured by the mystery of God rather than receiving measures or imposing measures from and upon the finite, from ourselves.
Interesting.
John Mark.
Yeah, it was interesting. I don't know Nicholas or Cusa very well, but I listened attentively. And when you were talking about, the judging with an eye for the concrete, and then I was also stuck about, the concrete and the problem of perspective, right? So when you're looking at the concrete, then we have a problem with where you're looking from.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of other classics also wrestled with the same thing, and some of them resolved to conscience, such that, the way you see it and you're convinced about it, and then you are allowed to stand by that as your truth, probably provided it does not, harm the rest of the persons. Because here we're talking about the limitation of our ability to grasp the truth. So does CUSA also subscribe to that kind of resolution?
Yes, I think as soon as you are aware of where are you looking from, what is your departing point, and then you realize that to see that you are already beyond that. So in the discovery of the limitation, you are beyond the limitation. That is in De Visione Dei, the vision of God. He has this beautiful experiment, perhaps you heard about it, with the all-seeing gaze putting on the wall, and he said he really sent to the monks of the Tegernsee, who asked him to write a book. Please write for us a book on mystical theology. And they were surprised when Cusa sent them a painting, Vera icon, with the gaze following you wherever you go. And he said, put it on the wall, and then you walk from south to the north, and you say, oh, I'm in the center, I know what to see, but then there is, you believe this until you meet another monk on the line who say, yeah, but I'm in the center. Oh my God, and instead of starting to fight like the Hobbesian modernity would do, this, oh, that's marvelous, mirabilis, you are in the center too, that's great, that means that what we see is much greater than we thought before. So it is the discovery, and then he quotes again a Greek philosopher. He likes to quote Greek philosophers. Xenophanes, God is for the lion, a lion, for the Ethiopian, and etc. And in the Visione Dei, it is not used as a critique to the anthropomorphism like in Xenophanes, but it is used as an argument that the discovery of your own limitation is the starting point of an infinite exploration of the divine, and it is only possible. It's only possible, he says, when you believe the other. That's in the text. When you believe the other, that he's saying, but I'm in the center too. That's the condition for this. and there's the difference between this is my perspective, and like most of the people today say, this is that's how I am. This is I'm an European. I cannot. That means that you don't believe the other. When you believe the other, then you see, we share the same infinite reality from different point of view. I don't know whether this is some about your point, but
do we have any other questions? Yes.
Inigo, what do you say to people who interpret Cusan's concordance of differences as an all too smooth form of consensus, or even worse, as a relativism? Since things are measured by a measure that cannot be known in itself, therefore no judgment, no final judgment is possible.
No finite judgment is possible as the last word. Cusa is not a relativist, but he shows that that even the relativist has to admit that you only can be a relativist when the different positions are related in one way or another. So that I don't know whether this is what you're thinking about, or yeah, you can say it is too smooth, it is too easy. But one of the when you read these texts against the background of the concrete political situation in Basel, I think then it's different. Then you can. Then it's not smooth. Then you have quite concrete measures and arguments how to deal with insights, with principles, with and of course he has not the ambition of a complete concordance. He in De Pace Fidei, it's a book written at the occasion of the fall of Constantinople. A Turkish friend was angry when I said this, but where different all the known people of that moment. The Americans are not in that in the Pace Fidei, of course, but they come together in the heavenly Jerusalem to talk about the situation, so how it is possible that there is violence in the name of God, and people are killing each other, and that should stop. This should stop is in the name of what it's about. It is not it should stop in the name of a kind of moral principle. No, they have to. And in the discussion between the Turkish and the Arabs and the Indians from India, the Africans from everywhere, and they all represent the position, of course, and they don't. It's not relativism, but they learn to look differently to their own position. When the Christian is talking with the Muslim and says, no, there's one God, and the Christian, that's exactly what we are saying, but you are stressing this more than we do. And of course, and perhaps that's the naive side of Cusanus, and he said, no, Yeah, of course the Muslim will understand the Trinity. Of course, since what is a Muslim doing differently than praying to God and being in relation to God? And when you're in relation to God, you are in Trinity already.
So the notion that the realizing that it is a different position is, I think, the definition of what relativism is. And if in the end he doesn't come to, as you just said, a complete concordance, then some people would say it can never be Catholic in the qualitative sense of the word.
Why
And
not?
yet the book is called The Catholic Concordance.
Hmm. Yes.
So where does the fullness come from?
But why cannot? I don't understand now the point. It cannot be Catholic. It cannot be general. Yes, it presupposes this Catholicity, and of course that could be a point of criticism of modern thinkers. They say, oh, you see, there are the Catholics again. They want to have everything, even the Hindus and yes, but I would say beyond Cusanus, perhaps, but in the inspired by Cusanus, the way we deal with the others is very Catholic, as Cusanus is, and there is again the argument: you only can think this from a concrete position, not from beyond. That's the interesting thing in the Pace Fidei. There is a Greek, that's philosophy, of course, and philosophy is not the discussion leader. He's one of the discussion partners. The real discussion leader is God himself, in fact, sometimes represented by Peter and so on, but Peter is more a kind of assistant of the dialogue leader. But that's very interesting and that's different than later Enlightenment projects of this. That even philosophy is a partner in the dialogue. Even philosophy is part of the church in this Cusanian way. Yeah. And of course he is struggling with that even this, and that makes him a saint and a church, a doctor of the church, that he is not able to solve it. He is not able to solve it. He tries to reform together with Pope Pius II. He was, of course, Cusa was the right hand of the Pope. I mean, he was not just a scholar somewhere. He was cardinal. He was the assistant of the Pope. And when the Pope was ill or had to go somewhere else, he represented the Pope. So he was like the Vice President of the United States.
I'd be reluctant to make that comparison.
Isn't he Catholic too? So that's, but he's struggling with that, of course. How you organize this? That is how you organize this. But there's also, and he does not solve the question, and he died too early. He had plans also to organize a real dialogue with the Muslims. He was searching for representatives.
A crusade as well. So
no, he was against the crusade. No, Pius II was.
Dennis
but
the
he was against the crusade.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. But okay, the crusade as well. But sometimes the crusade is not that. But no, but it was part of a reform program.
Yeah.
And with also the Cribratio al Qurani. He studied Quran as a kind of service for Pius II. So it is this difficult relation between theory and practice, which is the source of his theory. And so in that sense, I always will say no when someone says it is a smooth theory, since it is, how do you say, weerbarstig, it are not easy solutions, I think.
It's as difficult as the gospel, perhaps.
It is as difficult as the gospel.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Karl Jaspers he brought into the world this negative idea on Cusa. Since he had this idea, Cusa, he was speculative, the same level as Plato and Pythagoras, like Bruno, but he is speculative. But how is it possible that such a great philosopher made his hands dirty in ecclesial politics? And how is it possible that he was so narrow-minded that he helped the Pope and so on and so on? Of course, Jasper was a Lutheran. I can understand that, but I think this is another example. The relation between Nicholas of Cusa and the Devotio Moderna. The Devotio Moderna, the big reform movement, which also existed in Leuven, in the north, and Cusa was a critical friend of the Devotio Moderna. He went to the places where they are, and he tried to organize things. He tried to give it a juridical foundation. I have a lot of colleagues at my fantastic institute working on the Devotio Moderna, and they refuse to accept Cusa as part of the Devotio Moderna. For them, they say, "Oh, see, there we have the church again. They try to take everything." But that is not what Cusa is doing. He told me himself, so that's not what he's doing. He tries to organize it. He is an admirer of the Devotio Moderna, and he tries to give it a juridical status. That's also the epieikeia. It is, you need a rule before you can free of the rule, and that is why he is never disappointed. He failed in almost all his projects, but he is never in a melancholia or something like that. He's only one time when he's talking about Nijmegen, I think. They were all so kind to me when I came there, but I don't believe them anymore. When I left the city, they start again like before. Yeah. But yeah.
And some people have arranged lunch for us, and there's a rule that we should follow that, and let's not fail. So, thank you on that note.